All right, I think we're going to get started, but please, if you didn't get a chance to post to the chat yet, go ahead and do that. I will recommend that as we get started, Iris and Sarah and I have a lot to present to you today. So we hope to have a little space for questions at the end, but we cannot see you while we're presenting. So please feel free to turn your video off because we can't even see you. So here we go. So we decided to call this, we don't know all the answers, but we know we need to talk about race and identity because it is the truth. We don't know all the answers. We're just really starting to investigate and learn as much as we can and do the best that we can and keep learning and keep trying to figure out what is going to support and value all learners in our classrooms in this society today. So I'm Patty Forster, and I teach English 9th and 10th grade primarily at Camden Hills Regional High School. And I'm here today with my colleagues, Iris and Sarah. And Iris, if you would introduce yourself as well.
Hi, I'm Iris Eichenlaub, and I am the librarian at Camden Hills Regional High School, and I'm also an instructional coach this year. So I kind of do a lot of hats, I do a lot of tech too. And now I'll pass it over to Sarah.
Hi, I'm Sarah Cole-Pardon. I teach English at Camden Hills as well. I teach Honors 9, Honors 10, Humanities, and I actually this year created 2 new courses, Sci-Fi and Race and Identity, which I'm super excited about. And I'm really excited to be presenting today.
So our plan today, our goals are really hopefully to give you some inspiration and also an opportunity to think about an action that you can take as we move forward. So this is sort of the outline of where we're going. We're going to share a little bit of the personal work that each one of us has done because there are so many great resources in all the personal work we do. And then we're going to talk about some actions that Sarah and I have both done in our classes, as well as our English department. And then Iris is also going to share about actions she's done in the library, which I think are also applicable to if you have a classroom library. And then we're going to close with action steps. What can you do?
So we wanted to really talk a little bit about the start where you are concept. Why does this matter? And really for us as white educators, it felt very important to begin with trying to understand our own privilege and also our participation in racist systems that we've been imbued with and grown up with, and start seeing all of that, so that essentially we are not going to perpetuate more harm by our own ignorance. So it's an evolving process, and it's not certainly at all perfect, but we know that our good intentions are not enough, that our intentions don't necessarily translate into positive impact. So starting with the personal work felt really essential. Next slide. And this is our little reminder to you. So we know that you're like us, and you're people that love to fall down rabbit holes with links. So what we did with this presentation is that we've embedded links that are relevant to each slide in the slide notes, and you'll have access to the slide that's going to be put in to the chat towards the end of the presentation. And so just please come back and dive back in. I know for myself, it's hard to absorb everything all at once, but for example, with this slide, in the previous slide, I popped in some resources that were from a webinar that Patty and I attended, and it was for the Leaders for Just Schools, part of that learning. And so there's a couple of links in there, and some of them are some great prompts for starting your own personal work or continuing with it. So for me personally, I began a sort of a deep dive a couple of years ago and started to read and listen to podcasts and articles and books and documentaries. And then last year, I decided that I wanted to highlight some of the resources that particularly had strong impact for me in my own learning. And so it was an Instagram a day kind of a post that I kind of challenged myself with. And so in the link that you'll find in the slide notes here is a link to this document you're seeing. And then when you get to that document, you can click on each one of the titles and read just a little bit about the resource and why it was impactful for me. So we're going to share some work that we've done individually, personally, in our own growth, and thinking about our experiences with race and racism, with our own whiteness and white culture. And I visualized my sort of racial autobiography as a timeline. For me, it was a timeline. That's how I saw it. And as I kind of laid it all out for myself in front of me, this is just a little excerpt because it was like very long and skinny. A couple of things started to surface that I hadn't really framed in that way before. And so for me, the big takeaway was that I grew up in a really predominantly white space of highly educated, liberal-minded white people. Like, we didn't have BIPOC family friends. We didn't have any interracial marriages in my extended family. So it was a pretty white experience. And so that was just sort of what popped out about my early years.
So I thought about my racial journey a little bit differently. I write to process, so I just snapshotted a little bit of my writing. I also grew up in a predominantly white environment. The difference between Iris's upbringing and mine was I was raised in a very conservative, highly racist family. So throughout my years as a teacher, and then when I went to graduate school in Cambridge, I really had to learn to decenter my whiteness and really look at all of the things that have been ingrained since I was young. Oh, I'm echoing. I wonder why.
Keep going.
So I've really been working over the last few years since I came back to Camden to provide my students with a more representative look at the world and really begin having these difficult conversations. So you can go to the next slide, Patty. In all of my classes, we do racial autobiographies at the beginning of the year. We start with, of course, some just personal identity mapping, but then we talk about whiteness and our privilege. And these are just some examples that my students made this year of their own identity and the intersections in their identity. You can see the one with the actual map on it. This is an Asian American student, and she really talked about the intersection there. The one on the right is a cis female student, and she talked about all of her privilege. And then the one in the bottom left of the screen was a heterosexual white male, and he talked about how he has also experienced a lot of privilege, and later on he talked about how he's working to dismantle some of that privilege and have an understanding of it. So it's been really rewarding this year, and the students have really taken a lot of ownership in these discussions and really put themselves out there in our classrooms.
So for me, I also wrote my racial autobiography the first time I was in a workshop and they asked us to do that. And then later I heard in another workshop where they suggested thinking about your identity like water. So this is my experience with race over my lifetime. And I grew up in a small town in California that was 95% white. So it was like, to me, this little stream, and my college experience was the same. And my first teaching job, it actually flipped, and there was more diversity for me, but it was still limited because it was a 96% Hispanic community where I first taught. And then I moved to the San Francisco Bay Area, and the water was much wider at that point. My school was still was more white. It was 50% white, but we also had 30% Asian, 15% Middle Eastern, and 5% Black students. And then I moved back to my narrow stream teaching here in Camden, Maine, with a 95% white student population. So that's sort of my journey. I have my kids do racial autobiographies as well after they've done some personal identity work, like Sarah said. And so here's just a few responses from my kids, but it is, I think, really important for those that have only been in this community to recognize their limited experience, and also for those who have been in other places to recognize what they have experienced throughout their lifetime.
So we love all of these resources that you're seeing on the slide, and we could have a whole other session where we just talk about every single thing that you're seeing here, but we've got a lot to cover. So I would say that that resource that really impacted Patty and I both that we shared was the Seeing White podcast by Seen on Radio. It's a really excellent way to enhance our understanding of the design of white supremacy in our American history that we may not have learned in school. And then I would love to ask Sarah to talk a little bit about your fave here, the Smithsonian resource.
So if you haven't checked out the Smithsonian resource, I highly recommend it. You can take the lens of a parent, a student, or a teacher, and you can go through things like whiteness, privilege, American history, and it includes podcasts, videos, discussion topics, protocols. One of the things that I took away from it was the use of living room conversations, and I use those to bookend the school year in all of my classes, where we start off, we create this community, and then we have these living room conversations and follow a protocol throughout the year and do check-ins. And our last day, we have our final living room conversation and talk about how we've grown as a community. I can't recommend this resource enough. It's a great starting off point, and it has so many resources that you can filter into many different types of classes.
We wanted to highlight something that we were, all three of us, fortunate to participate in last summer, which was offered by Heinemann Institute. We love Heinemann Publisher and the awesome professional development that they give to teachers and educators. And so we and several members of our district were able to participate because this was a virtual institute and it's only $129. The registration has just opened and it's amazing. It was incredible learning from a lot of different angles, got us deep diving into the work, and then what a great way to have some conversations with colleagues when we returned. We wanted to talk a little bit about disrupt text because these are incredible thought leaders in the movement towards challenging that traditional canon and creating more inclusive practices in our curriculum. And so educators, librarian here, and the website of Disrupt Text is amazing. There's blog posts, there's specific learning guides for certain titles of books, and they just have, it's just amazing to sort of see inside the brains of these thinkers, and definitely highly recommend follows on Twitter as well.
So now we're gonna slow down and take a little breath and ask for you guys to do a little pause and reflect. We're gonna time you, it's a short amount of time, but you could either, we've got some choices for you, just start to jot down your own journey with race, or try to come up with some resources to share in the chat with the group. If you want to, if you're doing your autobiography, racial journey, handwriting, if you want to type it and share it in the chat, you can, but the chat's public. So just want to make sure that that's clear. So we're going to give you a minute and a half to write down or put in the chat either resources that you think this group might like to see that influenced you, or thinking about your own experience. Are you ready? Set, go.
It has been a minute and a half.
Okay, so if you've been typing, if you could finish, and it's something that you want to share, if you could finish that up and post it. So I can see that we have people posting some links if you want to check those links out, some stories about their experience, some authors that we should be watching and following as well, like Dr. Bettina Love, definitely, thanks Stephanie. And yes, that letting go of literary whiteness, I'm actually put that in my Amazon cart today. Thanks for bringing that up again. Oh, and a show, I love it. Another way of learning, Finding Your Roots on PBS. Thanks, Jack. So thank you all for those who shared, and we're going to move on. But Sarah, would you copy that part of the chat and throw it in the slideshow in the notes so that it's available to anyone else? Sarah's super fast on the computer. You wouldn't believe it. Okay, so moving on, here we go.
So obviously we in this session, I think I can make the assumption that we're all book people. We are all readers here, and probably also love talking about books, as we can see and have demonstrated. And so this little quote here just reminds us that Trey Johnson posted this last summer, but reminds us that it can't be it, that sometimes the work has to start in a very solitary way, because as white people, we have a lot to learn. And so that seems natural, but the books and the reading and then the book clubs, that can't be it. And so this is our transition into the action phase of our presentation for the next part.
So I wanted to share with you things that I've done in my English class, and then Sarah's going to share some of what she's done, and hopefully you can pull something out of there. So this is an example of something I might have taught in a semester of 10th grade English with my general ed students. And when you look at those 4 books, you find that 75% of them are white cis male authors and characters. There's 25%, which is one book that has an indigenous cis male author and character, and 0% of every other ethnicity, gender, culture, religion, sexual orientation. So the percentages were not good. So I had to make space. I had to let go of those books to make space for something different. So I decided to design my semester by doing a whole class novel and intentionally selecting a book that was relevant and important for the kids that I had in front of me right then. And then to also work on a personal identity inquiry with them together, and which works so well with our new main standard of writing inquiry. And then shifting to book groups, and I've been building that collection. I'll show you where it is today, with several diverse options, and having the kids do an identity inquiry about somebody other than themselves and somebody different from them. And finally ending with a student choice novel study, utilizing our library where it's just unlimited options, and they do their own choice inquiry inspired by the book they read. So it kind of looks like this with the 3 layers, that it starts with this teacher-directed surface learning with the whole class novel, teaching them some skills and ways of looking at books differently, and then getting into the book groups, which is more student-directed, a little bit deeper learning. And then the student choice is really the opportunity for it to be independent learning, that transfer of learning. And I don't have to have read all the books. It's even better that way, because it's really about what the kids do with them. And that brings me to this quote by Kylene Beers on Bob Probst, which I think is so important for us to think about. Rigor is not an attribute of a text, but rather a characteristic of our behavior with that text. What are we asking our students to do with the text? And Trisha Barvia, one of the Disrupt Text movement folks, recently posted this. She says, and by the way, YA is an audience, not a genre. So when educators disparage YA, they're like saying they're not complex enough to use in the classroom. They're disparaging an audience that they teach.
And I put the link to the full Twitter conversation, the Twitter thread, which was excellent. And Trisha really goes into some depth here. So even if you're not a Twitter regular user, you can just click on the link and take a peek at that. It's excellent.
Thanks. So this is kind of what my semester design looks like in the last year or so. We're doing this parallel instruction with the novel studies in the variety of ways, and the identity inquiry with self to others and also with their writing, building their confidence initially and their development, and eventually their fluency with the writing. And I do want to note that I always reserve 10 minutes every day for free choice reading, no strings attached, just read. And my kids are reading a lot now that I've given them that time. And then thinking about writing, I've threw this in here as well from Malcolm Gladwell, that they can do a lot of shorter writing pieces that don't need to be grading. It's really just thinking and reflecting on what they're on themselves and on others and what they're reading. And so Malcolm Gladwell says that writing should be simple enough that it doesn't defeat the reader. And that's what we're hoping to get them to appreciate reading, gain something from the reading, and write in a way to process their thoughts, not to feel defeated. So as Sarah and I mentioned earlier, we really believe that you've got to start with personal identity activities before you get into white privilege and that kind of thing. Like, who are we? And then go beyond that. So this book, Being the Change by Sarah Ahmed, I think it was originally written for middle school, but there's so many great activities that can be adapted to high school in this book. And so one of the ideas in this book is to do an identity web and to start it early on in the year, which gives you, the teacher, information about your kids. It's awesome. And you can share yours so they know a little bit about you and can see some connections, and then to come back to it later in the year and add to it. So the one that I posted here, I've added to each time. I've thought of new pieces of my identity that I could include there. And I do want to say, when I started to do this work, I always had this hesitancy to bring certain books into my classroom, particularly books that had to do with police violence against Black people, because my wife was a police officer in the city, in a ghetto, and it was really scary. And she was a good police officer. She cared about people and she did things for them. And so to bring a book in that I felt disparaged police officers made me nervous, and I didn't want to do that. And then I heard Sarah Ahmed speak, and she said, how ready am I to decenter myself to make space for someone else's truth? And that was a moment that actually really changed me. And I realized I was limiting my kids' opportunity because I was centering my experience, centering my experience with my wife and being a police officer. But the truth that some Black people in some places are treated poorly by police officers, that is their truth, even though it might not be mine. And we need to expose our kids to all perspectives and everyone's truth. So once we've done some personal identity work with our kids, we can move on to exploring other identities. And I want to share these texts with you. This particular book, Tell Me Who You Are, was created by 2 teenagers. Incredible. They traveled the US and interviewed people. I think they did 500 interviews, and then put this text together, kind of like a textbook about race and culture and identity. And it tells their story of their journey and includes interviews, like 1 to 2 or 3 page interviews with folks all over the US. And so my kids, we looked at this text and we would go into chapters, and they would get to kind of flip through and look at the pictures, pick a person and read about that person's identity, and then reflect on what they learned about from that experience. And they really appreciated this text as a way to see beyond our white Camden location. And the other 3 texts there are books of short stories with authors of all kinds of identities and characters of all kinds of identities. And so I'm using these right now to bring in new short stories with my 9th graders. So I'm going to kind of pass on this, but there's a link on this slide. This is a little student response of how my kids appreciated it, but I kind of just talked about that, so I'll move on. I do want to tell you that I'm so excited. I raised money to give this book away. We were going to do this presentation last year at the MCELA conference and give away 30 copies of this book, because I raised enough money to do that, because I think every English teacher should have this in their classroom. So we're going to give these copies away to you. At the very end of this session, we'll have an exit slip for you to fill out and put your name and address. And everybody here gets a book today, because we have fewer than 30 people. So who knows, we might end up with 2 copies, so you could give one away to someone else. We'll see. So remember my before. I had 4 books, 4 books that I did in a semester with 3 white cis males. After, this is my book groups. that's not the books that they did for student choice studies, and it's not the whole class novel that we did. But we have so many possibilities of someone they can read about and find out about somebody beyond themselves. And so my kids are doing this now just because everything was delayed this year with the pandemic, but this is my little slideshow. There's a link in this slideshow to my slideshow that you can click on each picture, and it goes to a little summary of the book because I couldn't give my kids the hands-on opportunity to look at the books this year. So it's a virtual tour of the books. And then when you bring in student choice, when you give them an opportunity to read anything and you take them to the library or the library comes to you, Eris brings books about identity, all kinds, brings them on carts and comes to my classroom and does book talks, and we have books all over the place. And it's incredible, and the kids find something that really engages them. So when you do that and you bring in book groups and student choice book studies, the percentages change drastically. Who knows how many white male authors or characters might be read about, and look how many other genders, other ethnicities, cultures, and identities. It just becomes so much more. So Sarah.
So I decided to bring the honors perspective to the 10th grade curriculum. And I think one of the unique things about this is I get a lot of parents who are very concerned about, they want their students to read the classics they read in high school, and they want to make sure that they're prepared to go on to high-level colleges. And I'm really working to dismantle this concept that rigor of equals old classic books, and that rigor is, as Patty said in the quote, what you do with the text. So this is my before. As you can see, there's really nothing after the 1920s. And there wasn't a lot that students could connect to in this. So I thought that this year of all years was the best time to completely dismantle all my curriculums and all my classes and do some real work with student choice, with representative texts.
Just clicked the wrong thing, sorry.
So I switched around how I did things. Typically poetry is done second semester, and I started with it this year. And I found that it gave us a lot of ability to work on students' own personal identity. And we explored poetry through different forms. And I was able to bring in so many unique perspectives, regardless of, including authors of color, teen poets, international poetry. So it was really, really fruitful, and students actually ended their poetry unit with an activism project. So it really inspired inquiry. Then in order to kind of build this whole class understanding of othering, which has been kind of one of our themes this year, I actually kept Frankenstein. It's really cool that it was written by a female author in a time when women authors weren't really celebrated. So we discussed othering, philosophy, we learned about different lenses. So we could actually examine Frankenstein through a racial lens. How can this actually relate to race in America? And again, we had some really cool inquiry projects with Frankenstein, but that set our foundations for what the heck is this literary canon that everyone talks about? Their parents always like, are you reading from the canon? Oh, this is a canonical work. This is really important. Everyone should read Shakespeare. So we examined what is the literary canon, who decides what the literary canon is, and do we agree with this arbitrary canon? And students read a lot of articles and do a beginning reflection on, do they find value in the canon? And my students are always kind of split down the middle. Some students are like, we should only read this in class. And some students are like, abolish it. So based on that, I have students do book choice. And these book choice actually center around different perspectives. So students could read nonfiction or fiction texts, novels in verse, graphic novels. They kind of ran the gamut. And then they did an inquiry project about an issue from their text and worked on rhetoric and actually gave speeches that were really powerful this year. I mean, there were some where we were in tears. They were just incredibly moving speeches about things that really mattered to the students, racial issues, policing, assault on women. They were just absolutely moving. And we took this discussion of the canon and are now using Disrupt Text and looking at Their Eyes Were Watching God and The Great Gatsby. So we're starting with Their Eyes Were Watching God, and none of my students had ever heard of it. And it is one of the most beautiful texts I've read. And my students are like, well, I've never heard of it. Why is this considered a classic? And I was like, because of the enduring themes and and the empowerment of women. And we're actually comparing that to Gatsby. Why is Gatsby so much more popular? Why is that what we see being taught in most sophomore curriculums? And we're doing this compare and contrast and then figuring out ways to dismantle the canon. Next slide. So this year, again, as I said, I wanted to really just overhaul my curriculum. And this is just a start. I would really like these ratios to be different. But for every white male cis author, I committed to providing at least one alternative perspective. So for every white male poet, I would bring in some poets of color, some poets, international poets. I had Latinx poets. For each text that I read, I would pair it with other works, including Mary Shelley. I paired her with Ralph Ellison, which I'll talk about in the next slide. I would really like these ratios to be like 2 to 3. But this was, I thought, a really great way to start this year. And it was something that I could commit to. And I think taking things in small steps that are manageable is what is really going to work. I'm still have so much more to do with this. I especially want to bring in more Indigenous authors. But again, this is my starting place. Patty. So here are some of the pairings that I did this year. These are not just for my Honors 10. These are throughout my classes. But some examples, I do narratives. I love David Sedaris. It's awesome to have an LGBTQ author, but pairing his view of childhood with Sandra Cisneros' view of childhood has been really powerful for students. Ray Bradbury paired with Ken Liu. If you haven't read The Paper Menagerie by Ken Liu, I highly recommend it. It's a life-changing collection of sci-fi short stories that bring my students to tears, which I think it's really powerful when students actually connect that deeply to stories. As I said, Ralph Ellison and The Invisible Man pairs great with that othering with Frankenstein. And Salman Rushdie. So I teach Heron in the Sea of Stories, which, going back to Patty's note on rigor, is actually a children's story written for Salman Rushdie's son. I mean, the reading level, the lexile, and that's very accessible. But students love it. And what we do with it is so deep. I just had students today be like, this is the best book I've ever read in school. And so it really is what you do with the text and how you dig your teeth in that really matters. Next slide, please. So with that dismantling the canon unit that we just finished, I had students do journal responses. They could draw their responses, they could podcast them, but I just included one written response about how their perspective changed from reading their text. So as you can see, we have nonfiction texts, we have fiction texts. Challenger Deep has been very popular with my class this year, which I'm going to bring in for book groups next year. Stamped White Rage. Surprisingly, I did not think my students would like White Rage. It's very history heavy, but every student has read it, has said that it is life-changing, that every class should read it. So as you can see, there's just one response, and I think the next slide is also some more responses. I got so excited when I read the response that says, oh man, I'm just so excited about this amazing book. Everyone should read this. And now the student will take any recommendation I give because she just loved Someone Knows My Name so much. So students were really invested and really digging into their text and the issues surrounding it. And it was far richer than any work I could have ever done with Macbeth. So my classes, I really focus on creation tasks. Again, I teach mostly honors. So we're really focusing on not necessarily the basic skills, but taking it to that next level and really digging in with creation, those higher levels on Bloom's. So we work with stylistic and analytical writing skills with our whole class novels. We work on personal reflection and speaking skills with our choice reads. That's how I've kind of been able to have some accountability and some interaction, because sometimes it can be really hard when students are all reading different books to conduct a class and have that literary community. So we do a lot of discussions, some visuals, presentations together, and speeches. And then my creation tasks really apply their learning. So it could be activism projects. I had students write letters and send stuff to our middle school about why we should be more diverse with our book choices. So again, that's building those leadership, those autonomy skills, that creation skill. Next slide. And so this is what a typical semester could look like. I mean, I don't even know at this point, because we have so much more choice in the text, and my students are being exposed to so many more really awesome perspectives.
All right, so I am up, and although I deal with a big library, a lot of what I'm talking about can apply to your classroom libraries for sure. Next slide. So I approached my fiction collection, a couple of years ago, because I knew that I needed to literally get my hands on the books to figure out what we had and who was represented. And so this was what I would consider an informal diversity analysis of my collection. And these were the questions that guided my work. And I was literally like holding every single book and looking at it, checking out the author and the publication, and sometimes doing some research on the computer. So it was a little bit of a slow process, but felt very important. And so, what I realized was, yeah, we had the big names, Louise Erdrich, we had Amy Tan, we had Toni Morrison, heavy hitters, right? But what we were really lacking was widespread diversity in our YA contemporary authors. And that further, some of the books that I had actually reinforced some of the stereotypes around BIPOC experiences. So what I found a lot of was urban poverty for Black and Latinx protagonists. I found things like violence and gangs and single parent households and teen pregnancy, and they were like all like problem books. And I became concerned because, as we've mentioned, we have like 97% white student body here, that perhaps these could be the only experiences of other races that my readers could encounter, and that was reinforcing what they're probably already getting from everywhere else in their life. Next slide. And so that became the big question, was whose story was missing. And so, I started to pick up things about like, well, we needed some more about gender identity. We needed some non-cis folk stories on the shelves. We needed more queer stories. And what I was really looking for was lesbian and bisexual stories. We needed Native American representation in the sort of YA audience. And we needed regular teenage life, that just happened to feature people of color as a protagonist, but having similar identity experiences like our students are having as they grow up, bumping into like, I want to borrow the car and like, dad won't let me, like those sort of more mundane issues, not to take away from some of the strong sort of, stuff that is out there that reflects police brutality, which of course is real and very present, but to add to that, to show us some Black and brown joy. Next slide. And so on this slide, and again, many links down below in the Linkity link, but a couple of things, especially to highlight for you as classroom teachers. So the Lee and Low Classroom Library Questionnaire is a great one to check out. And that sort of like gives you a little checklist. And I would add that, students can really be a team with you on this. If you've got a classroom library that you might want to assess, work with students because they're discerning thinkers and readers, as you know. The other one I'll mention is at the lower right, the Required Reading Reconsidered. This is a resource I learned about from one of the creators, Monica Washington. And she developed a fairly simple tool to use when you're really thinking about your own curriculum, like Sarah was mentioning too. Like, okay, so my curriculum says I have to teach Gatsby in whatever grade, but what else could I pair with that? So it was a tool to sort of broaden that lens out and think, different media, different contributor, whether it's poetry, whether it's music, whether it's some kind of spoken word, and how do we enrich, same time period, but bring in other voices like Sarah has done with Their Eyes Are Watching God. And so then, of course, that question, well, how do we find these new titles? And next slide. The great thing is, like, it's never really been a better time to do this kind of research. So, you know, for example, like I get School Library Journal, and actually when I'm reading reviews now, I have to look pretty hard to find a white cis male protagonist. I still have plenty of those readers in my school, so I know that I need to both provide these windows, mirrors, sliding doors, like Rudine Sims Bishop has shared that image with us. So there's so much out there. I would point to you to the starting place if you want to start. The DOE has a great diverse book list page. It's kind of a clearinghouse for a bunch of other different lists. I would also point you to the ALA's inclusive book list as a place to start for, you know, for all sort of different types of identities to look at. And then just to really highlight, and you probably are already aware, but the Diverse Book Finder, which was also on that previous slide, Diverse Book Finder is out of Colby College. Right now, it's mainly with children's picture books, but it can be really great. And again, as we've been talking about rigor and how you can use a children's book for rigor, check out the Diverse Book Finder, put in a title of a children's book you're familiar with, see what comes back at you. And there are so many awesome theme lists and book lists, and you know, you need more like different types of families books, like they've got a ton. So have some fun digging into these resources. Okay, and so then the next step is, like, we have to promote our collections, right? Next slide. So I'm just going to share a couple of ways that we've done this in our school. Next slide. So we use a library software called Follett, which offers this wonderful visual way to look at books called Destiny Collections. And so we have kind of this growing body of, these are all physical books in our library, but here we have them represented in a very visual, you see the beautiful covers kind of a way. And so we've curated these lists. We're constantly adding to them. It's great for students who are, well, remote this year, but you know, they can browse from their classroom. They can come on down with some ideas of what they might like to find for choice reading. Next slide. So my good colleague Nazreen Griffin from the Lewiston Public Schools, she is also the Civil Rights Team Advisor, and she was working on this beautiful slide where these are the civil rights identities that they work with. And so she wanted to create this virtual library of some options to share with educators, and the civil rights team was working on fundraising, I think, for some of the books as well. So next slide. She reached out to me because she was like, I don't know anything about middle and YA. So what can you help me with? And so I reached out to a couple folks and some students of mine for their recommendations. And so I sent to her some of my recommendations, and I've put the recommendations, and like I've sent her a very long email with all these annotations. So I put that into a document that's in the slide notes if you want to sort of skim and scan for YA level or audience books. Next slide. Okay, all right, so this work is really, it can be hard and it can be lonely work in our schools, right? Especially, you know, for some of us. And so we're back to the whole start where you are piece. And, you know, touching every single book in my fiction collection was like a big commitment of time and effort and energy. And, you know, revamping your English curriculum, that's time, that's effort, that's advocacy, that's a lot of meetings, that's meeting with your curriculum committee, your administrators, right? So this all takes time. And so we often come back to another great TED Talk, which is start with the why. Why does this work matter, right? And for the three of us, anything that we believe to be in the service of helping our students become more versed and ready to meet the world when they step out of our doors, like our students, that's the reason why they're asking for this. So next slide. I'm going to read to you this quote from a student this year who submitted some feedback to the English department. Before last year, I didn't even know if it was okay to call Black people Black. I think we are hesitant to read diverse books and discuss them because we simply don't know how to. We are all afraid of making mistakes, of being insensitive, of saying the wrong thing. That is precisely why we need these books to learn. We need to have the opportunity to openly discuss racism and its nuances instead of denouncing it and then moving on. So that was sort of like, okay, well, she just said it, right? So next slide, we are going to share with you some of our next steps that we're going to take in terms of our own actions, and then you're going to be invited to reflect a little bit on that for yourself. So next slide. My next step is to really run another collection analysis. I have this great software and these tools to do it. It's been a little while since I've done it. So, you know, it's basically a deep dive that shows me in a printout form of like what I have and where and how. And so I would like to take a collection analysis. I would like to think about how to utilize some of the online diversity analysis tools that I know about now to really, again, look at my collection with fresh eyes, and then with the data from those reports to put together a multi-year plan for collection development that I'll be able to share with my administrator, my curriculum coordinator, to make the pitch for like, this is why I'm gonna need, you know, more money or whatever it is, your support. That's my action step.
And for me, I'm gonna keep working on trying to find more inclusive book possibilities that I could bring in either as a whole class read or in a book group or to my classroom library. So I'm just trying to represent as many different perspectives and identities as I can.
So Patty, next slide, please. So I have this really great opportunity of taking over our Honors American Studies, which is an 11th grade course. And my action step is to completely redesign it into an anti-racist course. And then hopefully this will actually snowball into the 10th grade, because I would really like to take a more humanities-based approach and link up our sophomore social studies and English classes, and then our 11th grade do some more choice as students are beginning to stretch their legs and determine who they are in this world. So many action steps, but I'm really excited to create a course that is centered on anti-racism.
And then because I'm the department head, and one of the goals our department set a year or so ago was to work on more inclusivity in the curriculum and finding more diverse books. Our next step is to actually do a curriculum audit of some kind, and we're not sure how we're going to do that yet. We're working on that. I think our district is also working on that at another level, but we've been looking at 3 tools that are linked on this slide, and the one that I like the best so far is the first one, titled Culturally Responsive Scorecard. So when I think about all this work, it is something that is continuous. We have to continuously improve, which is really what we do with everything in our classes as teachers. So I wanted to put this quote in here by Cornelius Minor, one of my favorites. He's a great speaker, and his book, We Got This, is incredible. And there's a link to an article, to a podcast he's on if you want to listen to it. He says, we're always revisiting ourselves, our practice, our outlooks, our experiences, and seeking to do better. I think in an ecosystem where everybody is busy and everybody's overworked and nobody ever has enough time, this year was the worst, how can we carve out spaces to do that work? That the way we do the work, it can't be limited to meetings. It can't be limited to reflection. That this is work that we have to do in an ambulatory kind of way. We have to keep walking forward with us. We have to keep thinking of what the next step is, what the next action is. So hopefully we do have enough time. We want you to think about what your next action step would be. And it really depends on where you are in your journey and where you are with your colleagues at your school, perhaps. But what is your next personal action step? What might you do in order to move this work forward for you? And so since we have a little bit of time, if you want to reflect and post a quick next step to share with colleagues, let's throw those in the chat. We are going to actually ask you to post your action step on our exit slip, which we're going to put in the chat, but don't do it yet, Sarah. Would anybody like to post their next action step in the chat? Or, hey, why use the chat? This is a small group. Would anyone like to share out loud their next action step? I'm gonna take this slide off for a minute. Sarah, you can post those links in there now. I'm gonna stop sharing. And let's look at our people. Look at our faces. We don't get to do that much. So would anybody like to share? Like, what are you doing next?
So I'll share, Patty.
Thank you.
My department in Kennebunk is doing a text study of the book Letting Go of Literary Whiteness. And yes, there's Margot holding it up. We're going to undergo a full curriculum review next year, and one of the goals is diversifying voices. And we started talking about that this year and kind of realized we didn't know what we didn't know, and we didn't even know why or how to pick books. Like, were we picking them specifically so we could talk about racial issues? Were we picking them because they were diverse literary voices? And then we came across this book, which is little but fairly expensive for a little book. It's like $30 a copy. I think it's considered a textbook. The two people who wrote it are college professors of people who will become English teachers. And our assistant superintendent graciously agreed to pay for it and bought us 9 books. Nice. So we are having our first meeting on May 13th to talk about the first 5 chapters. And that's where we're starting, so that next year we can actually perhaps take action.
So who knows, perhaps they will do an MCELA What's Working session. Once they do that, that could be a great one to hear about, that, or a book study even. Beth is on the executive board, so we might hold her to that. Anybody else want to share their action step? What's next for you? You'll just have to unmute and go for it.
Patty, I'm seeing that there's a really interesting question. Oh, sorry. I was echoing. An interesting question in the chat from Natalie. Natalie, would you like to post that to the group?
Hello. Yes. I just typed it out because I had a lot of thoughts and I needed to put them down. But this is on my mind lately. I felt like I had a good year of like, I didn't have much curriculum to overhaul because I'm a new teacher, but I did stuff that was all focused on diversity, equity, and inclusion this year, and it seemed like it was going okay, but it's off the rails with one of my classes that we're reading The Hate U Give right now, and it's really making me like sad and feel like I don't know how to get through to kids at all because of this one student. So if people want to read my message and have any suggestions for similar ways that they've dealt with these types of issues, I would be super thankful.
Natalie, I had a similar situation in my class last semester, and you know, I feel like for some kids, they need to hear these different voices, that kid in particular that you're talking about. And even though the pushback is disheartening to you, I think it's really important to remember that like that student still needs to hear that information, and you've got whatever 20 other kids who are taking this in. I know it's hard for me, and it sounds like maybe it's hard for you too. It's like when one kid seems to not be getting it, I take it upon myself to like definitely get that kid to get it. And I think that's what makes a good teacher. But I also think that there are some things that we have to remember, like if we're making one tick on the clock for them to learn a tiny bit more than they knew before, that's actually pretty powerful in the grand scheme of things. So I totally feel you in that sense of feeling disheartened. But I also think that you try to step back and remember like how many kids you're actually positively impacting by having the conversation that you're having with them.
Thanks, Leah. That was helpful. Pushback maybe equals growth.
I would recommend too that with that particular student, you said he was neurodiverse. So I had a student like that last year, and I had to talk to him individually and actually be really clear that it wasn't okay, like rather than more vague. So I think clarity with that student and separate of the class, if he is in special ed, with you could also bring that person in to help, but you probably need to set some clear boundaries. Any other advice and or want to share action steps?
Patty, I actually have a quick question because I did kind of post in the chat already that in my school, I teach freshman English, and there's only one other freshman English teacher with me. And together we have already decided we want to change things up. So we've looked at several of the short stories that Patty had posted earlier, those anthology collections. And we're just trying to decide which book to really kind of bring into our curriculum, or should we have like literature groups where they can have more of the student voice and whatnot. But I just had a question because my coworker is like on board, wants to do this, but we also are a very small rural community. I don't know our percentage, but I would say we are like 99% white in our school. And so she's really concerned about community pushback, that we would have parents stomping up to the school and saying things. And we know that's happened someplace else in Maine. So has anyone experienced that? And like, we have like full autonomy. We can kind of do whatever we want, and our principal would totally support us. But also he would need to be aware if like you're going to have, 50 to 100 parents all of a sudden really upset that we are teaching them Stamped, or they're reading Dear Martin, or any of the others, right? So I would just like some feedback.
Well, just really quickly, because I want other people to speak to this. Choice, giving them choice. So the minute you say we're all reading this one text, that's when you get more pushback. So I would say choice. So those stories, we're not going to all read every single one of those stories. Let me present these as options. Other advice, anyone in the room?
I think letting go of literary whiteness talks about building in racial standards that are tied to actual like literacy things, like understanding theme and understanding other. So if you were doing a full class read, actually thinking about what is a literacy standard related to this book that would have something to do with having kids maybe step out of their own perspective and understand somebody else. Or so tying it in to something that is very literacy related, or your essential question, and then objectives that tie to that essential question. I'm not doing it justice, but
that's great. And I will definitely look into that to see what we can do around our standards and rewording them as well, because we are also looking at those new English language standards that have come out. So this is like the perfect time to like, and I never thought of that. So that's great, Beth. Thank you. I'll bring that to the table.
I put the link for the social justice standards by Learning for Justice, used to be Teaching Tolerance. But you can pull some of those and include those as part of your curriculum. Any other advice, questions, comments? We are at 5:01. So if you've got to go, I want to give you the freedom to go. So before anybody else has any last minute questions or anything, Sarah has posted in the link our exit slip, which is where you get to put your address so that I can send you books. We can send you books, which I'm so excited to do. And there's also the link to the slideshow, and the slideshow has a lot of links. So, if you're interested in anything that any one of us brought up, you have the accessibility there. So make sure to open each of those before you pop out. And anyway,
at the very end of the slideshow is all of our contact information, because as you could probably see, we love supporting folks and helping folks and talking to people about this really important issue for Maine students. So please do not hesitate to shoot us an email or whatever.
And Bree, I teach 9th grade too, so you and I should talk. But anyone else? Other thoughts, comments, questions? Feel free to exit.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks for coming in.
Has anyone heard of the novel The Good Braider?
A good grader.
Okay, good, good. I've read it, but I had never heard of it before today, before like this year when we were thinking about adding that. So I'm glad to know that that's pretty popular.
And I don't know if you saw, but Stephanie Hendricks just posted that they teach that. And she's a great resource for this kind of work if you want to connect with her. Stephanie, if you want to throw your email in there.
Connect with Bree for sure. If any of you saw or listened to the segment I did with Maine Calling last week, they did a segment on National Poetry Month and our governor's recent declaration. And I had suggested that they explore verse novels. They had never heard of verse novels before. So they had Terry Farish call in, and they were asking her why she wrote the novel in verse, and she said, because it told me to. Like the novel came to her in this verse form. And during that particular during that show, there were some great ideas about why you would want to read and teach a verse novel. So Bree, I'd love to talk with you as well, and you know how to find me.
Also,
Beth too. She's teaching that same one. Throw your email in there, Beth Carlson.
Oh,
Also, Terry Farish was the keynote speaker at the MCELA conference some years back, and we all got a copy of that book.
And also, if you
Fabulous.
don't know, Carrie Barbosa is our MCELA president now.
And
Bree.
Patty is the vice president.
Bree, I
Margot's
have,
dying to
I have
speak.
another suggestion for you, if that's okay.
Yes.
If you talk to the Holocaust and Human Rights Center up in Augusta, you can also bring in speakers to speak about the immigrant experience and do some groundwork to show that these stories are very complex and that this is just one set of pixels in the grand portrait. They will come in and do that.
Yeah, I can't wait that we can like open up our classrooms again to guest speakers and presenters for
You
sure.
could Zoom them in.
Yes, yeah.
Any other thoughts, comments, questions? We probably could talk about this forever, but it's a conversation that needs to continue and keep happening. And so perhaps maybe at MCLA, we can create a more of a discussion group versus a presentation. I think that might be a good idea. So we'll see what we can come up with moving forward.
great. Thank you.
Thanks
Thanks,
all
Beth.
for being inside on a really beautiful afternoon too.
Gosh.
Thanks
Yeah.
for the great conversation, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you. You guys did a great job.
Thanks,